Chapter 7, Part 1 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matthew Westra. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 7, With a Mule Train Across Nhambiquara Land, Part 1. From this point we were to enter a still wilder region, the land of the naked Nhambiquaras. On February 3, the weather cleared, and we started with the mule train and 2 ox carts. Fiala and Lieutenant Laureado stayed at Utiarity to take canoes and go down the Papagaio, which had not been descended by any scientific party, and perhaps by no one. They were then to descend the Juruena and Tapajos, thereby performing a necessary part of the work of the expedition. Our remaining party consisted of Colonel Rondon, Lieutenant Lyra, the doctor, Olivieri, Cherry, Miller, Kermit, and myself. On the Juruena we expected to meet the pack of ox train with Captain Amilcar and Lieutenant Mello. The other Brazilian members of the party had returned. We had now begun the difficult part of the expedition. The PM files were becoming a pest, and there was much fever and beriberi in the country we were entering. The feed for the animals was poor, the rains had made the trails slippery and difficult, and many, both of the mules and the oxen, were already weak, and some had to be abandoned. We left the canoe, the motor, and the gasoline. We had hoped to try them on the Amazonian rivers, but we were obliged to cut down everything that was not absolutely indispensable. Before leaving, we prepared for shipment back to the museum some of the bigger skins, and also some of the weapons and utensils of the Indians which Kermit had collected. These included woven fillets, and fillets made of macaw feathers, for use in the dances, woven belts, a gourd in which the sacred drink is offered to the god Inuere, wicker work baskets, flutes or pipes, anklet rattles, hammocks, a belt of the kind used by the women in carrying the babies, with the weaving frame. All these were Paresis articles. He also secured from the Nhambiquaras wicker-work baskets of a different type and bows and arrows. The bows were 7 feet long and the arrows 5 feet. There were blunt-headed arrows for birds, arrows with long, sharp wooden blades for tapir, deer, and other mammals, and the poisoned war arrows, with sharp barbs, poison-coated and bound on by fine thongs, with a long, hollow wooden guard to slip over the entire point and protect it until the time came to use it. When people talk glibly of idle savages, they ignore the immense labor entailed by many of their industries, and the really extraordinary amount of work they accomplish by the skillful use of their primitive and ineffective tools. It was not until early in the afternoon that we started into the sertão, as Brazilians call the wilderness. We drove with us a herd of oxen for food. After going about 15 miles, we camped beside the swampy headwaters of a little brook. It was at the spot where nearly 7 years previously Rondon and Lyra had camped on the trip when they discovered Utiarity Falls and penetrated to the Juruena. When they reached this place, they had been 36 hours without food. They killed a bush deer, a small deer, and ate literally every particle. The dogs devoured the entire skin. For much of the time on this trip they lived on wild fruit, and the 2 dogs that remained alive would wait eagerly under the trees and eat the fruit that was shaken down. In the late afternoon the piums were rather bad at this camp, but we had gloves and head nets and were not bothered, and although there were some mosquitoes, we slept well under our mosquito nets. The frogs in the swamp uttered a peculiar loud shout. Miller told of a little tree frog in Colombia, which swelled itself out with air until it looked like the frog in Aesop's fables, and then brayed like a mule. And Cherry told of a huge frog in Guyana that uttered a short, loud roar. Next day the weather was still fair. Our march lay through country like that which we had been traversing for 10 days. Skeletons of mules and oxen were more frequent, and once or twice by the wayside we passed the graves of officers or men who had died on the road. Barbed wire encircled the desolate little mounds. We camped on the west bank of the Burity River. Here there is a balsa or ferry run by two Parecis Indians, as employees of the Telegraphic Commission, under the colonel. Each had a thatched house, and each had 2 wives. All these Indians are pagans. All were dressed much like the poorer peasants of the Brazilian back country, and all were pleasant and well behaved. The women ran the ferry about as well as the men. They had no cultivated fields, and for weeks they had been living only on game and honey. And they hailed with joy our advent and the quantities of beans and rice, which, together with some beef, the colonel left with them. They feasted most of the night. Their houses contained their hammocks, baskets, and other belongings, and they owned some poultry. In one house was a tiny parakeet, very much at home and familiar, but by no means friendly with strangers. There are wild Nhambiquaras in the neighborhood, and recently several of these had menaced the 2 ferrymen with an attack, even shooting arrows at them. The ferrymen had driven them off by firing their rifles in the air, and they expected and received the colonel's praise for their self-restraint, for the colonel is doing all he can to persuade the Indians to stop their blood feuds. The rifles were short and light Winchester carbines, of the kind so universally used by the rubber gatherers and other adventurous wanderers in the forest wilderness of Brazil. There were a number of rubber trees in the neighborhood, by the way. We enjoyed a good bath in the Burity, although it was impossible to make headway by swimming against the racing current. There were few mosquitoes. On the other hand, various kinds of piums were a little too abundant. They vary from things like small gnats to things like black flies. The small stingless bees have no fear and can hardly be frightened away when they light on the hands or face, but they never bite, and merely cause a slight tickling as they crawl over the skin. There were some big bees, however, which, although they crawled about harmlessly after lighting if they were undisturbed, yet stung fiercely if they were molested. The insects were not ordinarily a serious bother, but there were occasional hours when they were too numerous for comfort, and now and then I had to do my riding in a head net and gauntlets. The night we reached the Burity, it rained heavily, and next day the rain continued. In the morning the mules were ferried over, while the oxen were swum across. Half a dozen of our men, whites, Indians, and Negroes, all stark naked and uttering wild cries, drove the oxen into the river, and then, with powerful overhand strokes, swam behind and alongside them as they crossed, half breasting the swift current. It was a fine sight to see the big, long-horned, staring beasts swimming strongly, while the sinewy, naked men urged them forward, utterly at ease in the rushing water. We made only a short day's journey, for owing to the lack of grass, the mules had to be driven off nearly 3 miles from our line of march in order to get them feed. We camped at the headwaters of a little brook called Huatsui, which is Parecis for monkey. Accompanying us on this march was a soldier bound for one of the remoter posts. With him trudged his wife. They made the whole journey on foot. There were 2 children. One was so young that it had to be carried alternately by the father and mother. The other, a small boy of 8 and much the best of the party, was already a competent wilderness worker. He bore his share of the belongings on the march, and when camp was reached sometimes himself put up the family shelter. They were mainly of Negro blood. Struck by the woman's uncomplaining endurance of fatigue, we offered to take her and the baby in the automobile while it accompanied us. But alas, this proved to be one of those melancholy cases where the effort to relieve hardship well endured results only in showing that those who endure the adversity cannot stand even a slight prosperity. The woman proved a querulous traveler in the auto, complaining that she was not made as comfortable as apparently she had expected, and after one day the husband declared he was not willing to have her go unless he went too, and the family resumed their walk. In this neighborhood there were multitudes of the big gregarious crepuscular or nocturnal spiders, which I have before mentioned. On arriving in camp at about 4 in the afternoon, I ran into a number of remains of their webs, and saw a very few of these spiders themselves sitting in the webs midway between trees. I then strolled a couple of miles up the road ahead of us under the line of telegraph poles. It was still bright sunlight, and no spiders were out. In fact, I did not suspect their presence along the line of telegraph poles, although I ought to have done so, for I continually ran into long strings of tough, fine web, which got across my face or hands or rifle barrel. I returned just at sunset, and the spiders were out in force. I saw dozens of colonies, each of scores or hundreds of individuals. Many were among the small trees along the broad, cleared trail, but most were dependent from the wire itself. Their webs had all been made or repaired since I had passed. Each was sitting in the middle of his own wheel, and all the wheels were joined to one another, and the whole pendant fabric hung by fine ropes from the wire above, and was in some cases steadied by guy ropes, thrown 30 feet off to little trees alongside. I watched them until nightfall, and evidently, to them, after their day's rest, their day's work had just begun. Next morning, owing to a desire to find out what the facts were as regards the ox carts, which were in difficulties, Cherie, Miller, Kermit, and I walked back to the Burity River, where Colonel Rondon had spent the night. It was a misty, overcast morning, and the spiders in the webs that hung from the telegraph wire were just going to their day homes. These were in and under the big white china insulators on the telegraph poles. Hundreds of spiders were already climbing up into these. When, 2 or 3 hours later, we returned, the sun was out, and not a spider was to be seen. Here we had to cut down our baggage and rearrange the loads for the mule train. Cherie and Miller had a most workmanlike equipment, including a very light tent and 2 light flies. 1 fly they gave for the kitchen use, 1 fly was allotted to Kermit and me, and they kept only the tent for themselves. Colonel Rondon and Lyra went in 1 tent, the doctor and Oliveri in another. Each of us got rid of everything above the sheer necessities. This was necessary because of the condition of the baggage animals. The oxen were so weak that the effort to bring on the carts had to be abandoned. 9 of the pack mules had already been left on the road during the 3 days' march from Utiarity. In the first expeditions into this country, all the baggage animals had died, and even in our case the loss was becoming very heavy. This state of affairs is due to the scarcity of forage and the type of country. Good grass is scanty, and the endless leagues of sparse, scrubby forest render it exceeding difficult to find the animals when they wander. They must be turned absolutely loose to roam about and pick up their scanty subsistence, and must be given as long a time as possible to feed and rest. Even under these conditions, most of them grow weak when, as in our case, it is impossible to carry corn. They cannot be found again until after daylight, and then hours must be spent in gathering them, and this means that the march must be made chiefly during the heat of the day, the most trying time. Often some of the animals would not be brought in until so late that it was well on in the forenoon, perhaps midday, before the bulk of the pack train started, and they reached the camping place as often after nightfall as before it. Under such conditions, many of the mules and oxen grew constantly weaker and ultimately gave out, and it was imperative to load them as lightly as possible and discard all luxuries, especially heavy or bulky luxuries. Traveling through a wild country where there is little food for man or beast is beset with difficulties almost inconceivable to the man who does not himself know this kind of wilderness, and especially to the man who only knows the ease of civilization. A scientific party of some size, with the equipment necessary in order to do scientific work, can only go at all if the men who actually handle the problems of food and transportation do their work thoroughly. Our march continued through the same type of high, nearly level upland, covered with scanty, scrubby forest. It is the kind of country known to the Brazilians as Chapadao, pronounced almost as if it were a French word and spelled Shapadon. Our camp on the 4th night was in a beautiful spot, an open grassy space beside a clear, cool, rushing little river. We ourselves reached this, and waded our beasts across the deep, narrow stream in the late afternoon, and we then enjoyed a bath and swim. The loose bullocks arrived at sunset, and with shrill cries the mounted herdsmen urged them into and across the swift water. The mule train arrived long after nightfall, and it was not deemed wise to try to cross the laden animals. Accordingly, the loads were taken off and brought over on the heads of the men. It was fine to see the sinewy, naked figures bearing their burdens through the broken moonlit water to the hither bank. The night was cool and pleasant. We kindled a fire and sat beside the blaze. Then, healthily hungry, we gathered around the ox hides to a delicious dinner of soup, beef, beans, rice, and coffee. Next day we made a short march, crossed a brook, and camped by another clear, deep, rapid little river, swollen by the rains. All these rivers that we were crossing run actually into the Juruena, and therefore form part of the headwaters of the Tapajos. For the Tapajos is a mighty river, and the basin which holds its headwaters covers an immense extent of country. This country and the adjacent regions, forming the high interior of western Brazil, will surely some day support a large industrial population, of which the advent would be hastened, although not necessarily in permanently better fashion, if Colonel Rondon's anticipations about the development of mining, especially gold mining, are realized. In any event, the region will be a healthy home for a considerable agricultural and pastoral population. Above all, the many swift streams, with their numerous waterfalls, some of great height and volume, offer the chance for the upgrowth of a number of big manufacturing communities, knit by railroads to one another and to the Atlantic coast and the valleys of the Paraguay, Madeira, and Amazon, and feeding and being fed by the dwellers in the rich, hot, alluvial lowlands that surround this elevated territory. The work of Colonel Rondon and his associates of the Telegraphic Commission has been to open this great and virgin land to the knowledge of the world and to the service of their nation. In doing so, they have incidentally founded the Brazilian School of Exploration. Before their day, almost all the scientific and regular exploration of Brazil was done by foreigners. But, of course, there was much exploration and settlement by nameless Brazilians, who were merely endeavoring to make new homes or advance their private fortunes. In recent years, by rubber gatherers, for instance, and a century ago by those bold and restless adventurers, partly of Portuguese and partly of Indian blood, the Paulistas, from one of whom Colonel Rondon is himself descended on his father's side. The camp by this river was in some old and grown-up fields, once the seat of a rather extensive maize and mandioc cultivation by the Nhambiquaras. On this day Cherrie got a number of birds new to the collection, and 2 or 3 of them probably new to science. We had found the birds for the most part in worn plumage, for the breeding season, the southern spring and northern fall, was over. But some birds were still breeding. In the tropics the breeding season is more irregular than in the north. Some birds breed at very different times from that chosen by the majority of their fellows. Some can hardly be said to have any regular season. Cherrie had found one species of honey creeper breeding in every month of the year. Just before sunset and just after sunrise, big, noisy, blue and yellow macaws flew over this camp. They were plentiful enough to form a loose flock, but each pair kept to itself, the 2 individuals always close together and always separated from the rest. Although not an abundant, it was an interesting fauna which the 2 naturalists found in this upland country, where hitherto no collections of birds and mammals had been made. Miller trapped several species of opossums, mice, and rats, which were new to him. Cherrie got many birds which he did not recognize. At this camp, among totally strange forms, he found an old and familiar acquaintance. Before breakfast he brought in several birds, a dark-colored flycatcher with white forehead and rump, and 2 very long tail feathers, a black and slate-blue tanager, a black ant thrush with a concealed white spot on its back at the base of the neck, and its dull-colored mate, and other birds which he believed to be new to science, but whose relationships with any of our birds are so remote that it is hard to describe them save in technical language. Finally, among these unfamiliar forms was a veery, and the sight of the rufous olive back and faintly spotted throat of this singer of our northern Junes made us almost homesick. End of Chapter 7, Part 1.